Bettina,
can you see the screen okay?
Yes, we can see the screen now.
So thank you, Ali, for the introduction, and I'm okay. Thank you, Ali, for the introduction. And I'm very honored to be here with all of you, wherever you are at the moment, either in Islamabad or on your computers. And I look forward to sharing some of my insights and experience of achieving enhanced performance in an international context. Excuse me for a second, I'm having some technical difficulties, so I'm just closing down a lot of stuff so that the presentation can actually run.
Yeah,
so
I would suggest
I'm
just,
back now.
Okay.
So,
all right, great.
Ali already introduced me, but I wanted to, okay, it's working now, I think. I just want to quickly sort of let you know why I'm so interested in performance management. And as a management consultant in human resources and change management, I've experienced all manner of performance management in a project context, in programs, and in line organizations. And a lot of these performance management approaches were very different that companies used. So some were solely financial results based, so that's the sort of typical balanced scorecards, appraisals, and the financial targets, and others sort of at the other end of the scale were highly supportive and enabling process focused. And there were sort of numerous combinations in between. What I also found was that, especially in an internationally and culturally diverse environment, some of the more linear approaches, and what I mean by that, the one-size-fits-all approach, did not necessarily give companies the desired results. So, you know, they were able to potentially maintain performance at the same level, but they weren't able to improve it with those results, and certainly not in all areas. And what these linear approaches fail to do is motivate individuals, and motivate individuals to release that extra discretionary part of their performance, that extra potential that we all have in us. And so today, this is kind of what I want to talk about, is very much the psychological side of performance management, so working with cultural and behavioral preferences to motivate staff rather than the hard side of performance management. So I want to run through 4 key areas. The first is building a strong multicultural team in an uncertain environment. And I'll also share with you the one thing that truly makes the difference here. Fostering cultural intelligence, how we can use that to help reduce interpersonal conflicts and misunderstandings. And thirdly, we'll look at 3 behavioral preferences, how we can motivate staff from different cultures. And finally, I'll close by sharing some insights on how to equip managers to address performance across borders, especially performance that is poor or not as we expect it to be. And for each of the 4 sections, I've selected one case study that I will use to illustrate this throughout. So first of all, I'd like to run through what is culture. And there are a number of definitions that I found across sort of different literature, and also you, I'm sure, have your own definitions. And what I've selected was the one that I found very helpful, which was saying, well, actually culture is the software of the mind or mental programming. And another one, the social anthropology definition, they're looking at it from saying it's common patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. So when we think of all these common patterns, I'm sure you've already realized that in various different types of culture. And one is, of course, the typical one that all of us always think about, the national culture. What's the culture in each country? But we also have regional, company, culture, project culture, family culture, and individual culture. So in actual fact, there are lots and lots of levels of culture. So that's why I like the sort of definition, common patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. So this is something we do share. And those patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting, things like shared norms, shared rules, shared assumptions we make, and certainly what's important to us in a group or even as an individual. So how can we recognize culture? Well, generally we recognize it through stories, shared stories that we have in organizations, shared memories, also in language. I mean, you all will have company jargon that you're using. It's part of certain values, beliefs, things that can be done in an organization and things that cannot be done. I apologize for this message coming up. I'm not sure how to get rid of it, so bear with me. And certain expectations that people have of each other, and also behavioral preference patterns. So how does culture manifest? So to give you some more examples, things like, what's important, what's not important, who we are not, how to behave and not to behave, what to do, not to do, what we like, what we don't like, how to say things, how not to say things, what is acceptable, not acceptable, who we trust, who we don't, and also what is right, what is wrong in a particular context. So now, how does culture actually relate to teams? It relates to teams in a number of ways. And one of the key things is that teams share certain patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. They share a certain mental programming, you could say. So sort of certain patterns that are common amongst the individuals in a team. So there are a number of characteristics of high-performance teams. I just want to run through those. So generally, you may have heard of these already, generally some characteristics. And the key research was done by John Katzenbach and Douglas Smith, and they published a book called Wisdom of Teams. And the last slide, actually, of this presentation has the references, so you do not need to take notes. And also, other research is done by the Human Dynamics Laboratory at MIT, in case you're interested in reading up on it. So what is it? High performance. First of all, is a shared purpose. The team member needs to understand what that is, what's the point of the team, and also the purpose needs to resonate with them as a team and on an individual basis. The goals for that team need to be ambitious and motivated. And then motivation, not for the team, but for individuals. Mutuality, teams can rely on each other, they know what each other is responsible for, and they also understand boundaries between each role within the team. Strong social cohesion, which means there is mutual support and trust, but also the shared values and that we talked about before, appreciation of others. This is very about able to address the in the team openly and also address the proverbial elephant.
Bettina, sorry to interrupt. Could you close
in a good way
your browser if possible? I think that might fix the problem. We're having little audio issues as well as this pop-up message that you're seeing. If you can close your Internet Explorer or even Chrome, the browser which you're using.
Sorry?
Can you close your browser if it is open? I think that might solve the problem of the message that is appearing.
Okay.
Okay, now, sorry. I mean, not close the presentation. I was saying the browser.
See if that works.
Okay, fair enough. So
okay.
Please proceed. Please proceed from where. Actually, I didn't want to interrupt, but I think we were having some issues with an audio also, so I just interrupted. Sorry about that. Please go ahead and continue.
Okay, no problem. Let me just close some and see if it works.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just go back to the presentation mode now.
Yeah, it's much better now.
That's where we were. Yeah, so better now.
Yes, it sounds better now. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to talk about others. Okay, thank you so much, Ali. And let's looking at the talents, the characteristic of high performance team, and what it also everybody brings. And it's not just the independently individual ones, the experience, skills, knowledge, understanding, ways of thinking, or ways of working that somebody brings, but also how these talents interact with each other. And the last one is followership. So this is the ability to negotiate between those who's following and how that dance between leadership and followership works. That seems to be that message still not going. And this also includes authority to make decisions and to act as a team and to act on any decisions that are made. So all these are, yes, they are team criteria for high performance teams, and they also apply to individuals. Each individual needs to understand them and then be It's especially important when we are in an environment that's uncertain, where individuals team feel authority and often affect the changes. So let me illustrate this on the case study that I mentioned. So, it's a company, they're based in both Europe and the US, and they have operations in major countries. And what they do is they deliver technology, so they develop types of organizations. So it's a business. They're incredibly fast-changing and high-paced because it's also internet technology. The environment is fairly uncertain because they go to suppliers fairly quickly. You know, they are for the last few years subject to budget constraints given the economic situations across the globe. And this company experienced was, yes, they were doing really well compared to a lot of others, but they wanted to grow and they felt they could do better. So when I went in there, I noticed that a number of the teams were fairly dysfunctional. What I mean by dysfunction is not that they didn't do the work, it's that there were several elements that they could have done on. And it was the interaction was open. So the key issues were very much the lack of ownership. So taking ownership for actions and progressing things without being told to do so. And that when as well as managers. It was more pronounced in the manager than the manager and individual team members. Lack of communication. So within teams, there were some people should know, shouldn't do. There were a lot of understandings between various people and also teams. Action bubbling along, and some significant negative events happened for that company. And these negative events were, something like customers were complaining about certain things. Then sometimes delivery dates weren't met, or they were met only when people working, all weekends for a long period of time, all evenings, all the hours that they could, and also key people were leaving, which was actually the big issue. They would take a lot of internal away and a lot of excess away with that the company needed. And, sad situation is not that uncommon in a lot of organizations today. So what to deal with those challenges, and bearing in mind those 7 characteristics of high-performance teams. So the challenges were the uncertainty of the environment, the constant changes also internally
Bettina, sorry to interrupt you again. People popping up the comments about the audio issue. I believe we are still having a little audio mash that we are hearing. Is it possible to close all the windows which are open and just leave the presentation window? Close all the windows which are open right now other than the presentation. Somehow we're having some audio mash going on.
Okay. Let me just close the camera so they briefly. Task manager. Yeah, so I've now closed everything that there is. I'm not sure why it's doing that now.
Yeah, please close the camera. Yeah.
So I'm not so sure. So let me just exit.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, that may have been, so I've exited that now.
So turn it off.
So yeah, that's it's taking some time. Yeah, I'm turning that off now. Let me just.
I think you had minimized the webcam, so we were not able to even see you in the beginning while the webcam was on. So finally, folks, we were able to see Madinah, and now I've requested her to close the camera, and that might have been an issue because your video streaming was going on. But nobody was able to see it because you had minimized it. So let's go.
Yeah, that could have been. I also.
Yeah, I think it's better now. Let's try to see.
Okay, is this now better?
It sounds better now, so let's see if it continues to remain the same note, then I might as well interrupt you again. But sorry about that. Please go ahead and proceed.
No, thank you, Ali, for letting me know, because, of course, on my side, I was hearing everything fine.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It sounds much better now. I think that might have been the issue because we didn't know that your webcam was on because it was minimized, but glad we were able to see you as well, and now it's minimized, so please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so what did we do to build a strong team given all these challenges? So the thing is, what the company couldn't provide, thinking back to those 7 characteristics, was a really detailed company vision because it kept changing on the details. On a very high level, of course, it was stayed the same. We couldn't provide detailed procedures and plans because, again, things were changing, new products were coming on board very quickly, and so also the ways of working kept changing in the overall company. There weren't always definitive answers to all questions that employees had, and also responsibilities of individuals couldn't remain static just because of that uncertain environment. So one of the things that was quite different to what the company had done before is actually we said well, let's look at what we can provide rather than what we cannot provide to people to minimize this uncertainty and help teams to actually perform well. So what we did was we developed clear team visions, and by we, I mean the teams. So each team was set to really develop what are you about? What is your purpose? And actually, instead of giving them a purpose, we asked them to develop the purpose. And also the team mission and values. And that made a huge difference because all of a sudden teams took responsibility and their level of creativity changed. And if there was an issue that people complained about, interestingly enough, they brought it to the team rather than to a leader or a manager, which they'd done before. We also put in place very clear roles and accountabilities, not in terms of the content of the role, in terms, so let's say, or your task is to do X, but to say, well, what are your accountabilities within the team to each other or to other departments? And that also completely changed the way people worked with each other. So it changed the ways of working, which we also asked them to develop further. And it changed just the tone within the company. People started actually to talk to each other, rather than, for example, send emails all the time, which fostered a lot of misunderstandings. And they also, interestingly enough, when somebody had delivered some work, they closed that off with them. They went back to others to say, thank you very much, this work has done this, and we've now done this with your work, which previously didn't happen. So most people who delivered something felt left hanging. We also developed very clear competencies, and especially competencies that were not subject to uncertainty. So competencies such as being proactive versus reactive, for example, or being leadership. Apologies, my screen has just jumped for some reason. So I'm not sure how to get that back right now. So bear with me while I try to get that back. And also competencies such as leadership versus manager. So that really people understood this is what we're looking for. And to each of the competencies, we attached behavioral expectations so people could recognize these behaviors when they saw them. So apologies, my computer seems to have stalled a little bit. I'm trying to get this back, but I'm not so sure what's it doing at the moment. So bear with me for a second.
Sure, please.
I'm just going to try and shut something more down with Task Manager because I think, it's back now, okay. Let me just shut something down here. Yeah, I think the webcam didn't quite shut down, so apologies for that. And this one, let's shut that down too. Okay.
Brilliant.
So this has now jumped. Okay. So let's just go back to here. Yeah. So this is kind of what we did in the building strong multicultural teams, and it did have a huge impact already. Then the next one I wanted to cover is fostering cultural intelligence. So whilst this company, they now had the sort of multicultural teams, we still had some challenges with conflicts and misunderstandings. So thinking back to the 7 characteristics of high-performance teams, whilst these are absolutely helpful and really strong, and already a wonderful thing you can do to move teams along, there's actually another factor which is incredibly important. And that's really the number one difference that makes the difference. And that is communication. It probably sounds like something very logical, of course, why not? But actually, that's often the one thing that's forgotten, or that's not entirely the focus. It's just one of the outcomes of strong multicultural teams. So communication is really the foundation of all of those 7. And just to illustrate that a little bit is how do we actually communicate and what happens to us internally when we communicate is outside events occur. There could be a communication, there could be behavior, and generally they run through certain filters. And when you read those filters, stories, memories, language, values and beliefs, decisions, expectations, behavioral preference patterns, you will notice that actually they're very similar or almost the same as to the elements of culture. So actually we have cultural filters that we run all the events through. So we already, make meaning of any communication based on our filters, our cultural preferences. And that affects our state, how we are, and affects our behavior, and then the results that we get. And so there is this kind of circle going on. This model, if you're interested, comes from neurolinguistic programming. This is just a really easy way to show how communication actually works for each individual, what happens. So culture and communication, how does that hang together? Well, actually a lot of these elements, what's important, not important, who we are not, what is right, what is wrong, they are part of our values and beliefs and also decisions that we've made. And also, how we behave, how to behave, not to behave, that's part of behavioral patterns, preferences. Or, who do we trust? That's often part of our memory set, our stories. And then how do we say things, not say things? What jargon do we use? That's part of language. So in actual fact, they're very, very closely connected. So now moving on to cultural intelligence. So this is the capability to function effectively in intercultural settings. And you may have heard of emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and the IQ, and cultural intelligence is kind of the extension of that now. What research has found that, again, with cultural intelligence, most of it, in fact, is communication. And there are actually 3 pillars, so to speak, of cultural intelligence. The first is self-awareness. So it's actually an individual understanding, what are my preferences, what are my values, what are my beliefs, what are the behavioral patterns that I prefer. The second one is awareness of other people. So what are theirs? What are their values, what are their beliefs, what are their behavioral patterns, their preferences? How do they like to work? And what information do they need to receive to be able to continue working effectively? And the last one is actually situational awareness. So what does this particular situation or environment demand in terms of behaviors or value sets? And to illustrate that with the case study, what we did was actually some training for the managers. Remember I mentioned before that managers didn't really act as leaders. They didn't really take ownership, and they certainly weren't leading the way for their staff. And the training was more of a workshop basis, and what we help managers to do is actually elicit their values. What was important to them about being a leader? and what were their behavioral patterns, their preferences there. And by behavioral patterns, I mean things like preferring big picture information versus detail. So how do they take in information? What type of information do they need? And also, how do they like to give it? It means how proactive versus how reactive were they? What were their preferences there? Did they need somebody to tell them, now's the time to act, which is reactive, versus, you know, if they just had a thought or an idea, they just went on and did it? And also, how did they like to manage people? Was it that they expected people to self-manage? Was it that they expected to set down the rules and people were just following it? Or was it a more interactive style, more flexible style? Also, their language preferences. And I don't mean national language now. I mean the words they were using, the types of words. Was it more a type of jargon, or was it more positive versus negative language? Was it more motivational versus traditional hierarchical language? So what was it that they themselves what were their preferences? And then we helped them to understand their team's values, behavioral patterns, and language, and really found out between that there was a huge realization for especially the leaders and managers that there often was a bit of a clash between them and their team members, especially around things like big picture versus detail, proactive versus reactive, and similar patterns. And also on a value set, there were quite a few differences. For example, some team members preferred to work very flexibly, i.e. flexible hours, whereas the managers, their expectation was, no, everyone has to be there at 9. That's it. No exceptions. That was their thing. And that meant for them, their value was commitment to the company. That meant commitment to the company. Whereas for a lot of team members, it didn't mean anything. It just meant they couldn't be flexible. They were still committed to the company, no matter when they turned up in the morning. So this training helped to foster this self-awareness and also awareness of others. And we held workshops with the various teams as well to help them understand from before the team mission, but also then in a little bit more detail, what are the values of all of us together. And what they found was very interesting. So I gave the example of commitment beforehand. Yes, they were actually all had the value of commitment, but how they interpreted it for each individual was quite different. And getting those interpretations surfaced helped the organization enormously, because all of a sudden they were really clear what commitment meant to every person, but also what commitment didn't mean. And then started to develop a team commitment definition that everybody could sign up to. And the same went for values like excellence in performance. So they had a real desire to be excellent at everything they did. And everyone had a slightly different interpretation of it. And getting that shared interpretation made a huge difference. Also, team behaviors, how would people interact with each other, the behavioral patterns. Recognizing if somebody was more, and I'd stay with the example of proactive versus reactive, if somebody was more of a proactive type, then yeah, you could just leave them to do things. Where somebody with a more reactive pattern, they just needed a trigger. They just needed to be told, it's now time to do this. And fostering that understanding of each other, again, made a huge difference and got rid of a number of those conflicts. We also helped them develop to have days in the life off, because it was such an uncertain environment. It was a real help for team members to just walk through, so how would a day work for me as a, let's say, software developer, or as a finance administrator, or as an HR person? How does that work? Who do I interact with? How does the interaction work? And just almost role-playing it through and ironing out some of the communication challenges that they did have. Interestingly enough, out of all those workshops, we really helped people to increase the cultural intelligence within the organization, and the way people spoke to each other completely changed. It was wonderful to see that there was a lot more understanding, and also people did not just go away with assumptions. This is what a person meant. They did ask questions, at least the next question. Somebody made a very general statement about something and somebody didn't understand it, or they felt, oh, maybe they meant something different. They didn't make an assumption, they asked the question. So very, very different, and actually productivity increased quite significantly just through that. So now moving on to motivation. Key motivators for performance are generally our values and the behavioral preference patterns. So why the values? Well, values are what's important to us. And if something is important to us, then we will be motivated to achieve it, do it, or go for it. And the same for behavioral preference patterns. If somebody is more of the strategic type, so big picture, or more of the detail, so more the tactical, then they feel comfortable doing that kind of work. And when somebody feels comfortable doing something, then they will do more of it. And they'll also do it to more depth and breadth. So we then looked at a number of these patterns within that. So for example, for values, is somebody going towards something or away from? And what that means is, for example, if we're looking at targets, do we have towards targets, i.e., you know, for a salesperson, converting 20 more customers, that would be a towards target, and an away from would be do not fall below conversion rate of 5 customers, for example. And the same, and usually what we have in away from targets, we usually have in health and safety, sort of reduction of error rates, and towards targets we tend to have usually in a sales environment, or of course in a financial environment where you want to increase growth, or a strategic environment is increase market share. External versus internal, that was another really important one. Are people motivated by external circumstances, that's the external, or the internal, do they have the motivation in themselves? So do they need any sort of external stimulus to do something, or are they just quite happy just to do it themselves? You can just leave them alone, don't have to put a lot of management or leadership effort in, they'll just go for it. And the last one is a really important one, especially in an uncertain environment. We all have a pattern how well we can deal with change. So how much do we need sameness, i.e. no change or little change, and can deal with, what's the sort of level of degree we are happy to have the same versus different. So how much change do we actually need? And there are people who need a lot of change, whereas others, they prefer to be in a very static environment. And this is a basic human need and a basic human pattern, that there are actually more people who prefer sameness, i.e. static environment, no change or little uncertainty, then difference, which meaning more change and potentially more uncertainty. And just being aware of that can be very helpful. So what we did with managers is really look at how do these three behavioral patterns or values, what can we do within the organization to support these for the various preferences. So if somebody is towards versus away from, then we were looking at, well, what can we do within the objectives and targets to have both? So that, you know, we actually cover both preferences, not just one. So that really it becomes generally motivational. And also looked at what do we want from people in terms of behaviors, which is the towards. Let's go towards something. And then the other side, what are our expectations? What's the minimum? What do we have to get away from as well? So what do we not want people to do? And really providing both at the same time. The internal versus external, that was a really interesting one, because external people, they tend to more likely look for outside input and certainly look for triggers from the outside. Internal people, they're self-motivated, however, they may be motivated into the wrong direction, so they might go off and do their own thing. So we were looking at different forms of feedback, but also sharing success stories and celebrating those, so that people with different preferences, they sort of understood, oh, this is how other people do it, and I didn't think of that, so I could do it this way. And again, that didn't happen in that company before, that these stories, these success stories, or what other people did were shared, not even in team meetings. So that was a big change for them. In terms of the sameness versus difference, we focused on what could be made certain. And as I mentioned before, in building the high-performance teams, is really thinking about what are the things that we actually do know in a volatile environment. And also, because a lot of people like it to be similar or the same, it's just focus on the evolution. What's the next step? And a lot of the time, the next step was actually what was happening anyway in the organization. So it wasn't really a massive change. It wasn't a massive uncertainty. It was just the next step in the evolution of the company. And yes, that takes some communicating. And it is a little bit of a play with language, and also with various of the elements of what's going on right now. But it has a huge impact when people realize, well, actually, this is not that much difference to before. We're just taking the next step. And the biggest factor in all of this is still the communication. We can never communicate enough. So the final area is dealing with poor performance across borders. So I will address this very quickly because I know we're coming to the end of our time. So generally, with poor performance, what I found is there are often unclear expectations, and that doesn't mean the expectations are unclear from the point of view of the company. They're often unclear from the point of view of the employee. Poor performance is often addressed too late, so it's already gone to a point where there's almost a point of no return. There is a lack of mutual understanding between the line manager and the employee often, and also in terms of the manager, there's often a lack of feedback competencies, i.e. they don't actually know how to give feedback to get somebody to change their performance. And in the case study, one thing that we did was very much clear up the competencies and also the expectations. So we introduced an expectation exchange between the manager and their employees. Rather than just having appraisals and objectives, we also looked at expectations. What do I expect from you? When do I want you to come to me if you have a problem? And also the other way around, when can an employee raise things to the manager if there is an issue? Working with feedback models, giving the manager a number of range of feedback models that could be used for different types of lacking performance, but also to just give feedback on good performance to make it even better. And also the understanding of motivating factors, and that goes back to the values and the behavioral patterns of an employee. How can a manager work with those to really motivate somebody who's not performing as well as we want them to? And this change was enormous. I have to say I hadn't expected it quite that strong when it happened, and it was wonderful to see. Because all of a sudden, because managers now had a different skill set around poor performance, performance management started to happen in daily conversations rather than at various points in the year. So if something was noticed, good or not so good, there was a conversation. And sometimes this can be a bit of a challenge, especially in international environments where the manager doesn't necessarily sit in the same location as the employee. Then that happened, phone calls, even short emails to say, hey, you did really well here, or can we have a short chat about? Previously that hadn't happened. People just did not address that. Staff also started to recognize when they were not performing well. Because a lot of the time, because there weren't clear competencies or expectations, they thought they were doing okay, especially the people with more internal self-motivating focus. They then realized, hold on a second, I need to do something about this. And also managers felt empowered to have the performance conversations at an earlier stage, rather than letting it develop to where there needs to be the first warning. And also, the other thing that was very good about this particular change in the organization was staff that were in the wrong role were now easily identified. And that happened in a few occasions because of the massive change this organization kept going through, was that sometimes people were just in the wrong role and their capabilities were not right for that particular job. And so they could actually be moved to a different role. And so then they started to perform again. So I just wanted to say thank you for bearing with me for the technical difficulties, and thank you for listening. So I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you indeed, Bettina, for quite an intriguing presentation. And folks, again, we also apologize for technical difficulties we experienced in the beginning, but we're glad we come over it. So now we're open for the question and answers. If you have questions, you could either raise your hand. Those who have joined in live, they can raise their hand. There is a hand icon available on the webinar console, and I'll give you a chance to speak to Bettina directly. Or you could put your questions in the question box, and I'll be happy to read them over on your behalf. Let me go over. There's a caller already raised hand. So we have as routine our Dr. Muhammad Rashad. Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Muhammad, could you please introduce yourself, where you're calling, which company you're representing, and ask the question, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dr. Shad Faridi here. Could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Bettina, for a wonderful presentation. And I have got two comments, not in fact questions. Is it, Bettina, will you agree that in the characteristics of high performance, one of the key reason maybe relationship building, you know, that's what I was thinking, that makes a very cohesive and a good teamwork. while we focus on relationship, internal as well as external relationship. And my second comment was dealing with the poor performance. Is it not, can the leaders like view the best practices of a specific industry so that the employees will be able to focus on what is where they are and what is the best-in-class practices, and then the opportunities for them, or eagerness or curiosity to be motivated to reach to that best practices. That were my questions.
Well, thank you very much for your comments, and yes, I do agree. So let me address the first one. Absolutely, building relationships is essential for high-performing teams, and sort of the key aspect of building relationships is good communication. So that is one of, so building rapport and relationships is really, the foundation again is the communication. So how do we interact, communicate with each other in the different ways?
Yes.
So fully agree, absolutely. The second point, yes. So sharing best practices is also a really, really good way of motivating others. And this really comes in when you make things more certain. Because that's really thing is in when there is uncertainty how to do something, sharing best practice is a wonderful, wonderful tool, because all of a sudden something goes from uncertain to certain. This is how we can do it and perform better. That's really brilliant. Thank you for your comments.
Thanks, and thanks Ali for giving me the opportunity.
And thank you, Dr. Muhammad, for your question. Let me move to another call we have. Try to unmute. Yes, Mr. Misbah Rahman, Brother Misbah, could you please introduce yourself and ask the question?
This is Misbah Rahman. I'm actually looking as a manager sourcing over here. So my question is, how can we identify the people with the wrong roles, or how can we evaluate the person who are not performing well can be identified as that they are on wrong roles, and how can we move to the other departments or another role?
Okay, thank you, Misbah. Bettina, let me try to repeat what I understood. The gentleman is asking, how can you identify a person who is being posted in the wrong role, and how possibly we can transfer him to a different role in a different project?
That's
Yeah. Well, thank you, Misbah, for your question. I'm going to mute you, and I'll have Bettina to further speak up on this and share her notes. Thank you. Yes, Bettina, could you please?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really, really good question. So how to identify somebody in the wrong role? Well, each role will have these kind of behavioral preferences or characteristics that I spoke about earlier. So what's the need to be proactive versus reactive? What's the need to be big picture versus detail in terms of giving and receiving information? What's the need to be internal, i.e. self-motivated versus externally motivated? So actually using these universal patterns rather than to say the tasks, they have to be able to perform this task, that task, this task, that task, that is actually a better way to do it. So yes, of course, the tasks and the responsibilities still need to be there. But actually, if we also look at those behavioral patterns that we're looking for, then we can see whether somebody is right for that role, whether they have, because generally most people, when they're in the role, they tend to have the skills to be there. Just something else prevents them from performing well. And generally, that's those behavioral preferences. And so that's kind of how we can do that. And for the case study organization, we actually looked at every role that we had, or the major roles. I mean, every role that would have been too much work, but the major sort of categories of roles. So each department said, well, what type of pattern are we looking for here? What types of patterns? And that made a huge difference, because then it was pretty obvious if somebody, for example, in a sales role was a reactive person, and that was their preference, then we'd sort of help them to either develop to be more proactive if that's what they wished, or we were looking for a different role where actually reactive was essential. So that kind of is how we went about it, rather than to look at, well, these are the particular tasks that somebody needed to do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory, and thank you very much for explaining this.
Misbah, let me ask you, are you calling from the NIBEF platform or?
Yeah. Actually, the voice is somewhat being, I'm
No.
not sure.
Are you sitting in the HR forum?
Can you repeat?
Are you sitting in the HR forum?
Yeah, I'm not sitting in the HR forum.
Oh, okay, I just wanted to clear out. Okay. So, Misbah, are you satisfied with the question?
Yeah, I'm pretty much satisfied with the question. But there's little explanation more if Bettina could explain that. Let's say if a person comes in a job for interview, and we identified that the person has this and this skills, and as per our observation we find that, okay, this role could be the best possible role for this position. Let's say a person come in for a job interview, and he do possess some software social skills, he have some skills regarding sales, he do have some other skills, like we can say development skills. So how can we identify that, okay, this area could be the best? If let's say that if the person who has come in for an interview, he's not so much capable of deciding by himself, but still he's you can say pretty much more motivated, and we can see the skills. The person do have the skills, but he's not unclear where to join or where should he be placed. So what should be the ideally benchmark where we could see that, okay, this is the benchmark to decide, okay, this person should be moved to the sales, either it should be moved to the social media, or whatever skills he do have. So what should be the benchmark, what should be the deciding criteria to determine that, okay, this person should be placed here, he could perform best over here? Yeah, that's all. That's my question.
Thank you for the question. I will try to answer this in a brief way. There's really no short answer, but what I would recommend is asking certain questions of the individual when they come for an interview, and these are pretty normal questions. So I've developed a question sheet for the various behavioral patterns. So you said whether they may not be able to make decisions by themselves. So that is one of the patterns, so that you would identify asking certain questions. And I've done that based on the NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming Meta-Programs. So it's a very technical term, but really it's the behavioral patterns that I was talking about that we all have. And so it's not a psychometric, so you don't have to pay for it. You can just get it for free from books. And one of the books I would recommend is Words That Change Minds. And I have it on the last slide, so I'm sure Ali will make the presentation available to you after this call. And there you can identify where is a person, what are their patterns here, what side of the pattern are they on. So if they find it hard to make or find it difficult to make decisions for themselves, that will come out in the interview. And it's also something you can then discuss with them. Say, well, what do you need to make the decision, and start asking the question up front before they are in a role. If the role is a role where they have to make decisions by themselves, then either they need help or training to actually change this pattern, or if they don't like doing it, if they really find it challenging to make decisions by themselves, then a different role where that's not required, i.e. not a leadership role, so a more team member role, would be more suitable. So it's really based on understanding those behavioral patterns, or in NLP they're called meta-programs, mapping them to the roles, and that's really fairly obvious once you've read through them once, what you would need, and then just asking the questions. And those questions are in fact provided in the book I've just mentioned. So it's a fairly simple process. It just needs to be applied. Does that help?
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Ba. I believe let's move to the next question, and we will make this presentation available as Bettina was mentioning, and I'll share with you guys where it will be uploaded by the end of this webinar. Well, once again, thank you for posting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we have another short question from Tuba Shahud. The question is, how often should we motivate our team members? That's a very generic question, but an interesting one.
Yes, that is actually a really good question as well. And I would say daily. And so, and let me qualify that answer a little bit. So in terms of daily, is having the conversations daily, not necessarily to have specific motivational interventions, but actually just finding out where are they at, what's going on, and showing an interest as a leader. So, and if you are in disparate locations, then of course daily may not be suitable. It's just not possible. Then do it as much as you can. Because, all of us human beings, we like to be valued. We like to be recognized for what we do. And also we like to be supported when things don't go so well. But if somebody isn't actually, it doesn't appear they are around or they are interested as a manager or as a leader, then we may not actually share what's happening. So it is really as often as possible, and it doesn't have to be much. It just may be, oh, how's it going? What's happening? Just let me know where you're at. What about this? What you're doing? Do just explain to me, and maybe just offering little things that may be suitable or useful for that team member. So, for example, when I was a global line manager in consulting, I just once in a while when I saw something that might be useful for a team member, an article or a training course, or sometimes it was something for free on the internet or whatever it was. I came across something or a book, I just sent it to them. Just out of the blue, I just said, oh, I saw this and thought you might be interested. And in the case study organization, for example, people started to just pick up the phone when they received an email from their team member, just to sort of clarify. And just having sort of simple conversations, interestingly enough, really motivated people because they felt seen, they felt heard, and they felt appreciated for their efforts.
Thank you very much.
Does that answer the question?
Hopefully, because it was posted in the question box. So let me move to another question. We have two more questions. There's an interesting one. While fostering cultural intelligence in multicultural environment, what do you advise about members of teams who group up together on linguistics commonality and start speaking up their own language while others feel alien and starts developing personal differences? How should managers tackle such scenarios within his or her team, considering the sensitivity of cultural respect?
So let me just check that I understood the question correctly. So this is about people starting to, groups of people who share a common language, they speak that common language whilst others who have a different language don't necessarily understand it.
Yeah.
Yes, so that is very common as an occurrence because naturally, we feel comfortable in our own language. And there are various ways of addressing that. Number one would be to, when it happens as a manager, to just raise it with the team to say, and in such a way to the people who speak in their own language while others feel alienated, to say, well, how would you feel if, somebody spoke a foreign language in your presence and you couldn't understand? And actually, help them to understand what that would be like. The second one, have an agreement within the team that only the shared language, whichever that is spoken, so that everybody can understand. And it does take a little while because our language naturally is, you know, as with everything, is a habit, is actually reminding people, let's go back to the shared language. You know, understandably, you know, you like speaking your own language, let's go back to the shared language if there's one person there who speaks another language. And, you know, I've also run workshops where that was the topic, and one thing I did was actually, you know, bringing out some of the values around it. And the caller, or the person who asked the question, mentioned respect. So one of the things that people raised in the team said, well, actually, if somebody speaks a language I can understand, I feel I'm respected. And so we had people share that, those feelings and those views, and it was interesting how each person then realized, well, actually, it is a mark of respect, and it's a mark of inclusion that I make sure I speak a common language or shared language rather than just my own. So, yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks. I think you have answered it quite elaborately. So let me move to one last question. Lots of psychometric tools are available in the market which are offering profile impression techniques to acquire new talent or build performance-based teams. Considering cultural norms are quite different universally, hence they do not necessarily apply on realistic grounds. Do you believe such tools are actually worth using for HR evaluations or building teams?
Oh, that is a really interesting question. I personally have used a number of these tools, and I fully agree. The cultural dimension is often not included, so they can be fairly limiting. So my personal preference has been to use something that is based on, as I mentioned throughout this presentation, on universal behavioral patterns. So they're not culturally specific. Yeah, one culture may have a tendency towards one pattern over another. For example, you know, if you look at you know, proactive versus reactive, there are some countries, you know, and you may think of them yourself, you know, some countries are much more proactive. They just go for it. That's just the culture, and some others are a bit more reactive. So using that as an example. So I've been using the NLP meta programs for that because A, they're free, B, they're very easy to apply, and also they don't preclude cultures. So they actually are very inclusive because these are just common human patterns that people have. And I would say if you wanted to use the psychometric, then it is very, very important to evaluate them very carefully, whether they're suitable for the particular situation that you're in. So not every psychometric applies to every situation. And also the reason why I chose the meta programs for the case study that I went through was because of the cultural dimension that this company had. It was based in so many different countries, had people from so many different countries working in each location, and also because of the uncertain environment they had. It pulled on so many different elements, the kind of the dynamics of the environment that they were in, that I just felt the psychometric, a normal psychometric was a bit too limiting, and that's why we chose the meta programs.
That really brings us
to... Does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. I think you've explained it very well. And that brings us towards the end of the webinar. Folks, this webinar is being recorded. I'm just broadcasting on the chat message, which will be available on your webinar console at the bottom. That recorded version will be available on our community, Mile community, which is community.mile.org. Please do sign up for free and stay tuned. It will be ready in the next couple of days. You will be able to watch the recorded version and equally download the soft copy of the presentation, along with and access to lots of other archives of recorded versions of the webinars which we have done in the past, or download the presentations. So please do sign up with the community. Bettina, thank you very much. I would like to especially thank you on behalf of MILE and HRF Islamabad Forum for a very wonderful presentation, a very comprehensive one. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give?
Yes, I would just say thank you very much for listening and for bearing with me with the technical difficulties. And I really enjoyed sharing these insights and experiences with you. And if you would like to connect with me, feel free to do so on LinkedIn. I know a few people have already sent me requests. So thank you very much. And when you download the webinar, you will see, I'm just jumping to that if I can. No, it's not working. But actually, the last slide of the presentation, slide 24, has all the references that might be interesting for you to follow up.
Yes, and a lot of people are asking about the reference books. So I advise that please sign in with the community. I think we will be able to upload it in the next couple of days. So you will have an access to the presentation copy where you'll find all the links towards the reference books. Once again, thank you, Bettina, for your time and for sharing this presentation with all of us. And thank you all of those who participated and joined this webinar live and asked the question and made it an interactive experience for all of us. And special thanks to Islamabad HR Forum for coordinating and arranging this webinar with us and for bringing the participants. And I understand there were about 50 plus in the hall who were actually watching this webinar live. So thank you all. I'm going to end this webinar and you all will be automatically dismissed out. So thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.